That night in March 2009, I was supposed to die, but instead, I discovered that something that shouldn't exist lives in the Shenandoah Mountains. My name is David Cross, and by that time I had already been working as a ranger at Shenandoah National Park for 8 years. During that time I saw it all, from tourists who got lost just 3 feet off the trail to bears tearing campsites to shreds. I knew every sound in those mountains, every scent, every shadow. At least, that's how it seemed to me. On March 13th, I was assigned to patrol the section of the Appalachian Trail between Skyline Drive and Thornton Gap. The standard procedure was to check the condition of the trail following recent rains, ensure that hikers had not set up unauthorized camps, and document any damage to the infrastructure. Those patrols usually lasted 5 or 6 hours, and by dawn I was already home. That night began just like any other. Around 10:30 p.m., I parked my company pickup truck in the parking lot at the trailhead and checked my walkie-talkie, flashlight, and GPS navigator. In my backpack I had the usual supplies: a first aid kit, spare batteries, a thermos of coffee, a signal pistol, and report forms. The weather was typical for March in Virginia, cool and damp, with thick fog swirling among the oak and maple trees. The first 3 miles passed without incident. The trail was in good condition with no erosion or trash. I noticed a few broken signposts apparently. Some hikers thought they'd make good souvenirs. Nothing out of the ordinary. The fog was getting thicker and thicker. Visibility had dropped to 20 or 30 feet, but I knew these trails by heart and could walk them with my eyes closed. Around 1 a.m., I reached the place we called Deer Glade, a small clearing where the trail opened up into an area about the size of a basketball court. White-tailed deer often grazed here, and tourists loved to take pictures of them. The clearing was surrounded by a dense wall of oak and horse chestnut trees, some of which were up to 4 feet in diameter. I stopped at the edge of the clearing to make a note in my notebook: the time, location, and condition of the trail. The fog was especially thick here. White clouds drifted slowly across the grass, casting whimsical shapes in the light of my flashlight. Complete silence reigned all around. It was almost too quiet. In the 8 years I've worked at the park, I've learned to distinguish between different kinds of silence. There is the natural silence of the night, when the forest falls asleep, yet life does not come to a standstill. Mice rustle in the underbrush, an owl hoots, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howls. And then there is the eerie silence when the forest freezes in fear. That kind of silence means there's a predator nearby, a bear, a puma, or something even more terrifying. That was exactly the kind of silence that reigned that night. I turned off my flashlight and listened. Nothing. There wasn't even a breeze. The fog continued to swirl, but silently, as if the whole world had turned into cotton wool. I turned on my flashlight again and shone the beam toward the opposite side of the clearing. Reindeer usually grazed there, near an old stump we called the Giant's Chair. Now the clearing was empty. I crossed the clearing and carefully examined the ground near the stump. Fresh hoofprints, no more than a few hours old, were clearly imprinted in the soft ground. But something about them didn't seem right. The prints were too large. A typical white-tailed deer leaves tracks about 3 inches long. These tracks were nearly 6 inches long and had a strange shape. Instead of the usual split hoof, these tracks looked split open. It was as if the hoof hadn't split into 2 pieces, but had cracked open along its entire length. I took a few photos with my work camera and measured the marks with a tape measure. 6 inches long, 4 inches wide, and nearly 2 inches deep. What kind of animal could have left such tracks? A moose? But no moose have been seen in Virginia for over 100 years. On top of that, even the moose tracks looked different. I followed the tracks. They led from the stump straight into the forest to the northeast, toward Hawksbill Gorge. The tracks were clear and easily distinguishable. The animal was obviously heavy, and its steps were deep and confident. But after 100 feet, the tracks suddenly ended at a large boulder. I walked around the rock from all sides, shining my flashlight on the ground and peering into every crevice. Nothing. It was as if the animal had simply vanished into thin air. Then I looked up and examined the boulder. The rock was about 8 feet tall and covered with moss and lichen. On the north side, where the tracks ended, I noticed some strange marks, 4 parallel scratches on the moss, as if something very sharp had scraped away the green covering. The scratches were deep, down to the stone itself, and ran upward at an angle. I touched the scratches with my palm. They were wider than my fingers and were at exactly the height I could reach when I raised my arm. What could have left such marks? A bear, but a bear's claws leave 5 scratches, not 4, and bears don't jump onto 8-foot boulders. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It wasn't a roar, a howl, or a snort, nothing like anything I'd heard in my 8 years working in the forest. The sound was high-pitched and piercing, like a whistle, but intermittent and sharp. It lasted about 5 seconds, and then it stopped. A few seconds later it happened again, but this time from the other side of the clearing. I froze, listening intently. The sound was coming from somewhere behind the trees on the western side of the clearing, about 40 meters away from me. I shone my flashlight in that direction, but the beam was lost in the fog after just 20 feet. I slowly began to move toward the sound, trying not to step on any dry branches. A minute later, I heard another sound, the crackling of branches. Something large was moving in the underbrush. Judging by the sounds, it was moving parallel to the clearing, neither getting closer nor moving away. It was as if it were patrolling the border. I stopped and shouted the standard phrase we used whenever we encountered wild animals. "Hey, get out of here. Go away." In response, I heard the same piercing whistle, but this time it was very close, about 10 meters away from me. I shone my flashlight in that direction and saw a silhouette. At first, I thought it was a deer. The silhouette was about the same size, and I could make out something that looked like horns. But when I looked more closely, my heart skipped a beat. The creature was standing on its hind legs between two oak trees. He was about 6 feet tall, maybe a little more. His body was covered with dark fur, which looked almost black in the light of the flashlight. There really were horns on its head, but they didn't look like a deer's. They were too long, too curved, and had sharp tips. But the worst part was the head. It wasn't a deer's head. She had human features, a high forehead, prominent cheekbones, and the shape of her skull. But her eyes, its eyes were enormous, the size of saucers, and they reflected the light from the lantern, just like a cat's, only not with a yellow or green glow, but with a cold, white light. We stared intently at each other for about 10 seconds. The creature didn't move, it merely turned its head slightly as it studied me. I could see its nostrils twitching, it was sniffing. Then it let out that same piercing whistle and took a step forward. I stepped back, keeping my eyes fixed on it, and began fumbling for my radio. But the creature moved faster, one more step then another, and it was already 5 feet away from me. Now I could see it clearly. Its arms were long and disproportionate, with sharp claws instead of fingers. Those very claws that had left scratches on the boulder. Its legs were like a human's, but they ended in hooves. Those very cloven hooves whose tracks I had found near the stump. The creature tilted its head to one side, just like dogs do when they don't understand something. Then it made a new sound, a low, hoarse sound, like a cough, and it lunged at me. The blow to my chest was so hard that I was knocked several feet away and fell into the mud. The creature pinned me down, and I felt its weight. It was as heavy as a grown man. His claws dug into my jacket, tearing the fabric. He gave off a scent, musky, animalistic, but with a hint of something rotten. I instinctively reached for my belt, where my signal pistol hung. My fingers found the grip. I grabbed it and fired without aiming, almost point blank. A red flare flashed brightly right in front of the creature's face. It recoiled with a wild howl, like the scream of a wounded man. I seized the moment, rolled aside, and jumped to my feet. The creature shook its head, clearly blinded by the flash. The red flame from the rocket illuminated the clearing with a flickering light, and I saw it retreat toward the forest, making the same rasping sounds. Its movements were unsteady. It bumped into trees and tripped over roots. I didn't wait for it to recover. Grabbing the flashlight that had fallen, I ran back to the trail. I could hear sounds behind me, the crackling of branches, muffled thuds, as if something heavy were falling and being lifted. Then a scream rang out, long, drawn out, full of rage and pain. I ran without stopping all the way to the parking lot. It wasn't until I saw my pickup truck that I allowed myself to stop and catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the keys into the ignition. On the way home, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. What was it? A mutated bear? A sick animal? But bears don't stand on their hind legs for 10 minutes. And they don't have horns. And they don't study people with such interest. When I got home, I took a closer look at my jacket. There were 4 parallel tears on her chest. Exactly like the scratches on the boulder. The fabric was torn all the way down to the lining, and dark spots were visible in several places. Blood. I took off my jacket and found 4 long scratches on my chest. They weren't deep, but they were painful. I cleaned the wounds with antiseptic and covered them with band-aids. After that, I sat in the kitchen for a long time with a mug of coffee, trying to figure out what to do next. Should I tell my boss? But what exactly would I say that I ran into an unknown animal in the woods? People would have laughed at me or sent me for a psychiatric evaluation. In the end, I decided to wait until morning and return to the scene with a colleague. Maybe in the light of day, it won't seem so scary. Maybe I'll find a logical explanation. On the morning of March 14th, I didn't return to Deer Meadow. Instead, I went to the park office and asked them to provide me with all the reports of encounters with strange animals over the past 6 months. Secretary Mary Johnson raised an eyebrow in surprise, but she handed me the folder containing the incident reports anyway. Most of the reports were routine. Bears at campgrounds, aggressive raccoons, coyotes near hiking trails. But 3 reports caught my attention. The first was dated October 2008. A group of tourists from Richmond reported seeing a large horned animal that was following them along the Falls Ridge Trail. The report stated that the animal was walking on its hind legs and making whistling sounds. Ranger Thomas Hill, who investigated the incident, wrote in his report, "It was likely a large deer that was startled by the presence of people. The unusual behavior can be explained by the onset of the rutting season." The second report came in January 2009. A local resident named Robert King called the park authority and complained that something was killing his goats. He had lost 4 of them in a week. The bodies were found with deep cuts to the throat, but the predator had not eaten the flesh, it had only drunk the blood. The veterinarian who examined the remains speculated that a large wild dog or a coyote was responsible, but King insisted that he had seen footprints the size of a dinner plate near his shed. The third report was the most recent. It came in February 2009. 2 students from the University of Virginia set up camp near White Oak Creek. Around 3 a.m., they were awakened by strange screams and sounds that made it seem as if something large was prowling around their camp. In the morning, they discovered that their backpacks had been torn open and their food scattered about. There were tracks on the ground around the tent that the students described as irregularly shaped hoofprints. I wrote down the addresses and phone numbers of all the witnesses. Robert King lived near the park, a 20-minute drive from Deer Glade. I decided to start with him. King turned out to be a man in his 60s with a gray beard and a suspicious look in his eyes. He lived in an old farmhouse at the foot of a hill, where he kept a small herd of goats and a few chickens. When I introduced myself and explained the purpose of my visit, his face clouded over. "So you finally decided to take on this case," he muttered. "And here I was thinking you thought I was crazy." He took me to the barn where he kept his goats. It was an old wooden building with a metal roof. There was a new lock on the door, and King had strung barbed wire around the perimeter. "After that incident in January, I reinforced everything," he explained. "But it doesn't help much. It still comes." "What do you mean by it comes?" King looked around, as if afraid someone was eavesdropping on us. "Every week at night. It doesn't attack anymore, but it wanders around the shed, sniffing everything in sight. The goats sense him and start bleating and pacing back and forth. And in the morning I find tracks." He led me behind the barn to a small pen. The ground there was soft and muddy from the recent rains, and sure enough, there were distinct tracks in the mud, the same ones I'd seen in Olenya Glade, large, split, and deep. "It came here the night before last," King said. "I even caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye when I looked out the window. It was tall, with horns. It was standing right where we are now, looking at the house." "Did you get a good look at it?" "No, it was dark, but I remembered the silhouette. It didn't look like a deer or a bear. And the eyes glowed in the dark." I took pictures of the tracks and wrote down King's statement. Then I asked if I could take a look at the spot where the goats had been killed in January. King led me to a small grove about 100 meters from the house. Among the pine trees, I made out the remains of an old fence. It seemed that this had once been a pasture for livestock. King pointed to a large patch of dark, dry ground. "This is where I found Belle, my best goat," he said quietly. Her throat had been slit but neatly, as if a surgeon had done it, and there was almost no blood. They'd drunk it all. I crouched down and examined the ground closely. The dark patch was about the size of a car tire. Next to it, on the soft ground beneath the pine trees, I found a few more tracks, but these tracks were different. While the prints near the shed clearly belonged to hooves, here in the grove I saw paw prints, human paw prints, 5 toes with sharp claws, a long foot, and deep indentations from the toes. It measured approximately 14 inches long and 6 inches wide. Those tracks could have been left by a very tall person, or something capable of changing the shape of its paws. "Have you seen tracks like this before?" I asked King. He shook his head. "No, just hoof prints. But these, where did they come from?" I didn't answer. Thoughts were swarming through my head. The creature I'd come across was standing on its hind legs, but those legs ended in hooves, and these tracks had been left by paws with toes. What did that mean? 2 different animals, or just one, but one capable of changing the shape of its limbs? I asked King not to tell anyone about my visit and returned to the park office. I spent the rest of the day studying old reports and maps. All the incidents had occurred within a 5-mile radius of Deer Glade. It seemed the creature had its own territory which it patrolled. That evening, I got in touch with the students from the third report. One of them, Josh Riley, agreed to meet with me the next day. We arranged to meet at a cafe in the town of Lurk. Josh turned out to be a serious young man in his 20s who was studying biology. He came to the meeting with a folder containing photographs and detailed notes. "I knew you'd get in touch with us sooner or later," he said. After that night, I started gathering information. And you know what? We weren't the first. He spread out printouts from the internet on the table. Articles from forums dedicated to paranormal phenomena, social media posts, and articles from local newspapers. All of these incidents occurred over the past 2 years, and all told roughly the same story about encounters with a deer man in the Shenandoah Mountains. Most people are afraid to talk about this publicly, Josh explained, but they share their experiences online. Take a look at this. He showed me a post from October 2008. A user with the username Mountain Hiker wrote, "I saw a strange creature on the trail near Skyline Drive. It was tall, had horns, and was standing on its hind legs. When I tried to take a picture of it, it let out a terrifying whistle and disappeared into the woods. The photo came out blurry, but you can make out its outline." A photo was attached to the post. The quality was poor, and the image was blurry, but the silhouette among the trees really did resemble what I had seen. A tall figure with horns and unnaturally long arms. Josh turned the page. And this is from last December. A local hunter found a bear torn to pieces in the woods, an adult male weighing about 400 pounds. Its throat had been torn open, just like Mr. King's goats. The photograph of the dead bear made me shudder. The enormous animal was lying on its side, its throat torn open by 4 parallel cuts, exactly the same as the ones left on my jacket. "What else did you find?" I asked. Josh pulled out a few more printouts. Here's the report from the vet in Harrisonburg. In February, the remains of a deer found near Lake Sheraton were brought to him. The cause of death was blood loss due to wounds to the neck. But here's what's interesting. The deer wasn't killed. It was simply bled to death. The vet wrote in the report that the wounds looked as if someone had methodically severed the arteries without damaging the muscles. "Like a vampire," I chuckled. "Like a surgeon," Josh replied seriously. "Someone who knows anatomy well and knows how to kill without ruining the meat." I made copies of all the documents and asked Josh to keep me posted if he found anything else. By evening, I had accumulated a whole folder full of evidence. The picture that was emerging was disturbing. Something was lurking in the Shenandoah Mountains, something that hunted large animals and wasn't afraid of people, something intelligent, cautious, yet incredibly cruel. And, judging by how often these incidents were occurring, it was becoming increasingly active. I hardly slept that night. Outside the window, I could hear the familiar sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustling of the wind in the leaves. But now every little sound made me tense up. I knew that creature was somewhere nearby, and that sooner or later our paths would cross again. Fortunately, nothing like that ever happened again, but that incident has stayed with me forever.